Now that we have examined St. Thomas Aquinas' 5 arguments for the existence of God, it remains to consider, as much as possible, what kind of being God is. As Aquinas would be the first to admit, there is much about God's nature that we just cannot know. But nevertheless, the arguments for his existence that we've seen over the last 4 lectures do reveal at least some things about him that we can come to understand. Perhaps the first and easiest to understand is that God must be an immaterial or non-physical being. How do we know this is so? Probably the best place to look are the first and third of Aquinas' arguments for his existence. Recall that in the first argument, Aquinas explained that God must exist as a first mover. Recall also that motion, as defined under this argument, was nothing other than the reduction of something from a state of potentiality to a state of actuality, as when something goes from being potentially hot to actually hot. As the argument went, this never happens without the causal influence of something that is already in a state of actuality, such as the hot burner that heats the water on the stove. As we observe changes of all kinds taking place all around us, this can only be ultimately explained by some first cause of change that is not subject to change itself, an unchanged changer or unmoved mover. But in order to be not subject to change at all, a thing must also be immaterial. To be material, in Aquinas' and Aristotle's words, is to have an element of potentiality that would necessarily make something subject to change. As long as something is material or physical, even only in part, there's always something about it that could change. It could go from smaller to larger, from one color to another, from hotter to colder, and so on. So long as God is not subject to change, it must also follow that he is immaterial. The third argument for God's existence proves this as well. Recall that, according to the third way, God must exist as a necessary being. This did not mean that God's existence is necessary for the existence of the world, though that is certainly true as well. It means rather that God's existence is necessary in and of itself, and that consequently God is a being that cannot not be, in the same sense that a triangle cannot have anything other than 3 sides. But upon reflection, nothing that is material or physical could fit this description. Any material thing could not exist. To put it in a slightly more cumbersome but more accurate way, for any given material thing that exists, there is a conceivable and logically possible state of affairs in which that thing does not exist. But if God cannot not exist, which is the definition of a necessary being, it follows that he cannot be material. In fact, reflecting on the third way also reveals another of God's attributes, namely necessity itself. And so we can confidently say, based on the 5 arguments for God's existence, that God possesses the attributes of immateriality and necessity. If God exists as a necessary being, in the sense that he cannot not be, it must also follow that he is eternal. If it is impossible for something not to exist, it is also impossible that that thing ever comes into existence or goes out of existence. But if it's impossible for God to come into existence or go out of existence, it follows that he is eternal. It's important, however, to take notice of something that this does not mean. Notice that in arguing that God must be eternal, Thomas Aquinas does not say that God always was, or that God's existence spans backwards for an infinite duration of time. This does not follow, although Aquinas would argue that it's logically possible. The reason for this is to say that God always was runs the risk of implying that time itself goes back infinitely, and that God's existence goes back infinitely along with it. But Aquinas' teaching, if we remember, is quite different. Even if time itself has a definite beginning at some moment in the finite past, it still follows that God is eternal. The universe may have come into existence 13 billion years ago, but God, as a necessary being, could not have. For the same reason, even if time should ever come to an absolute end, this would not mean the end of God. In short, to say that God is eternal means that he is outside of and independent of time, not that he exists for an infinite duration of time. Aquinas' other arguments for the existence of God reveal still more attributes that we might assign to him. According to the second argument, God exists as a first efficient cause, or the cause that is ultimately responsible for the existence of everything else. So in that sense, God must be, in a crucial sense, creative. Furthermore, following the fourth argument, according to which God is the ultimate standard of goodness, it follows that he cannot in any way be lacking in goodness, for then he couldn't be the standard. And so we may otherwise state that he possesses the attribute of perfection. Additionally, if we examine the fifth way, we might say that the design and rationality discoverable in the natural world must have God as its ultimate explanation. And so we must conclude that God is, in some important sense, rational or intelligent. In Aquinas' view, however, none of these divine attributes are fully understandable without comprehending what is admittedly the most confusing of God's properties, namely his simplicity. What does it mean to say that God is simple? Well, first and foremost, it means that God has no parts that are distinguishable from one another. In this sense, simplicity is defined over and against complexity, which means having a multiplicity of parts. Now, as we've already seen, God cannot have any material parts for the reason, as we've just seen, that he's not a material being. But for Aquinas, God's simplicity means more than this. It also means that God's immaterial attributes are not ultimately different from one another as they are in created things. So, a human being might have the attributes of being male, European, courageous, and just. But each of these things, though perhaps related in some sense, are different attributes. God's attributes, however, let's say justice, wisdom, mercy, omnipotence, and omniscience, are all actually, according to Aquinas, the same thing in God. Our own finite minds may distinguish these and other of God's attributes, but that's only due to the limitations of our understanding. Everything about God, says Aquinas, not only his attributes, but even his thoughts and actions, are nothing other than his one simple perfect act of existence, the very same act of existence that brings the world into being. So his wisdom just is his mercy, which in turn just is his omniscience, which in turn just is his justice, and so on. So not only are there no parts in God, there is no distinction of any kind. Why must this be so? As Aquinas argues, the reason for this perplexing conclusion about God is the fact that God's existence is identical with his essence. As we saw back in Lecture 6, the opposite is true among created things that we observe in the natural world. For human beings, dogs, cats, trees, rocks, or any other created thing, what that thing is distinguishable from the fact that it is. All these things have a certain kind of essence or nature, but existence is no part of that essence or nature. In other words, existence for everything but God is accidental or non-essential, which means that they only happen to exist. But as we've seen, God does not just happen to exist, he exists necessarily, which is to say that his existence is essential to him, as three-sidedness is essential to a triangle. In fact, if God's existence was to be found outside of his essence, that would immediately raise the question as to why God exists. God's existence would require an explanation outside of himself, and as we've seen, no such explanation is possible. So for Aquinas, the easiest way to explain this fact about God is to say that in God, existence and essence are just one and the same. But by the same argument, God's essence must also be identical with every other attribute we might apply to him. So God is perfectly just, wise, merciful, and omniscient, but his justice, wisdom, mercy, and omniscience just are his existence, which in turn just is his essence. In fact, Aquinas will say that God is nothing short of the fullness and perfection of existence itself, to the point that whatever else exists only because and to the extent that it shares somehow in God's existence. Existence, therefore, is not merely a concept or idea. It is an actual or real thing that explains the real and actual existence of everything else. This is also why there can only be one God. There can only be one being that is existence itself. Because if there were more than one, the absurd conclusion would follow that there are two existences. But then we would really be talking about two beings that merely happen to exist, and whose existence would still need to be explained by some still more fundamental being in whom existence and essence converge. What do we even mean then when we say that God is just or merciful or forgiving? As Aquinas explains, to say that God is just means something very different from saying that a human being, or a human law, or a human society is just. In other words, God does not merely possess justice to a higher degree than a human being is capable of possessing it. God is just only in the sense that, since justice is a kind of perfection, it's true to say that God is just only in the sense that he is the perfection of all existence, and of existing things like human beings, that might be called just in some more specific sense. So God cannot be called just in a sense that is univocal, to use a way human beings can be called just. But for the same reason, Aquinas argues that calling God just is also not a mere equivocation, as when two words are used in entirely different senses, as for example in the case of the word bear, meaning to carry something, and bear, meaning a large hairy animal that hibernates. Since justice is a perfection in existing created things, and God is the perfection of existence itself, it follows that, as a human being becomes more just, wiser, more virtuous, and so on, they become more, and not less, like God. So human perfections may come to resemble God's perfection, which again just is his existence, as they become more perfect. But God's perfection does not really resemble any human perfection, or the perfection of any created thing for that matter. This is why, between the univocal and equivocal uses of language, the best way to understand our language about God, says Aquinas, is analogical. In other words, created perfections are something like the perfection of God's existence, but not in the sense that God possesses those same perfections only to a higher degree. Again, God's perfections are simply his existence, which is to say that they are all identical with one another. This is the essence of God's simplicity. One common objection to this teaching about God is theological rather than strictly philosophical. As we've seen, if God is truly simple in the sense that Aquinas means, it also follows that not only God's attributes, but all of his actions and thoughts are identical with his essence as well. But if God's actions and thoughts are nothing other than the simple act of his existence, what are we to make of the Bible's claims that God has engaged in very specific actions throughout history that seem to be quite distinguishable from one another? For instance, a reading of Scripture has God conversing with Cain at time 1, having a conversation with Abraham at time 2, and sending a hailstorm at time 3. How can God perform these three distinguishable actions if all his actions, like all his attributes, are just one and the same? As the great Thomas Aquinas scholar Eleanor Stump has argued, this difficulty can be resolved once we come to understand the distinction between God and his effects in the created world. The conversation with Cain is one effect. The conversation with Abraham is another effect. And the hailstorm is yet another effect. But these are all effects of a single act of existence that is God. As she puts it, quote, God's talking to Cain is not the same as God's talking to Abraham. But that undoubted distinction does not compromise God's absolute simplicity, because those events are to be understood as various temporal effects of the single eternal act, God's action in the strict sense. Everyone recognizes analogous characterizations of ordinary human actions. The man who flips the switch on the wall might be correctly described as doing just that one thing, or he may, equally correctly, be said to do many things in doing that one thing: turning on the light, waking the dog, frightening the prowler, etc. A case of one action with many correct descriptions or many consequences, of one action in the strict sense and many actions in a broader sense. End of quote. So just as by flipping the light switch, someone may correctly be described as waking the dog or frightening the prowler, inasmuch as these are effects of a single action, so also God may be correctly described as speaking with Cain, or sending a hailstorm, inasmuch as these happen to be effects of God's act of existence. To be sure, this flies in the face of the way most of us originally understood the Bible, as describing a powerful deity going through, even if in charge of, historical events himself. It is then another example of how philosophy allows us to understand the words of divine revelation better. Just as God's words spoken to Moses, I am who am, reveal not just a being that refuses to give Moses more information than he's entitled to, but a being that is his own essence, whose very essence it is to be. For this is the philosophical root of his simplicity, the most difficult, but also the most profound of all God's attributes.